Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I want to welcome you to a very special Let Us Reason series here, and that's Refutation of Shabir Ally with my brother Anthony Roger, also known as Rabbi Anthony Ben Rogers. So, I mean, it's up to you guys. You can choose whatever name you want, but every time I see him, more hair, man, more hair. So I'm jealous of your beard, brother. But to say is I want to welcome everyone who's joining us. This is a special time, obviously, so we're going to attract more people in the Middle East and also in Asia and Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. So I'm excited about that because I think rarely that we've done something, you and I, this late. I do things with Sam that are even later. So we even attract people from Australia and New Zealand and other places. Although I see some Aussies here, apparently they stay up late. So all that to say is thank you so much for to everyone for joining us. Brother, thank you so much for making time for us. I know today's been a busy day for you, probably based on what you told me, but I'm thankful that you crafted out this time for us to continue with our series from the book of Hebrews to refute Shabir Ally's basically claims against the deity of Christ. With that in mind, I turn it over to you, brother.
Yeah, well, first, I know why you go on late with Sam. Sam doesn't get up during the daytime. He doesn't want to frighten all the normal people.
That's right.
The darkness helps to, yeah, but thanks for having me on. And for those that don't remember, you and I have been looking at Hebrews, and part of the reason for that is because Shabir, in the debate that I did with him not long ago on the Trinity, he made the claim, and it was remarkable to me, that the book of Hebrews, among other New Testament books, makes some tantalizing remarks regarding Jesus, but they fall short of identifying him as fully divine. And this was surprising to me for a number of reasons. Ordinarily, Shabir's approach, and I know that you've talked about this before with other guests, but ordinarily his approach is to go to certain books of the New Testament that he thinks teach a low Christology, and he's willing in that context to grant that some other books present a higher view of Jesus, because he's trying to argue that the books of the New Testament give us an evolving Christology, so they don't give us a consistent witness, in which case the upshot is, well, we don't have to listen to any of them. If they're not giving us a unified testimony concerning Christ, then we can't really trust them, can we? Now, we've all argued against that. We've pointed out that there is no low Christology at any point in the New Testament. Every single book of the New Testament teaches the same exalted Christ that Christians have always worshiped. But in that supposed trajectory from low to high Christology, it's usually granted that Hebrews, as well as the Gospel of John, among other books, is one of those that's on the upper end, where it seems to have this more exalted view. And a lot of this comes right out of liberalism, right? The liberal approach has been to say basically that you have a liberal or evolving Christology, but usually liberals will grant that when you get to a place like John's Gospel or the book of Hebrews, here you're dealing with an author who identifies Jesus as God. And so it was surprising to me hearing Shabir thinking that he can get away with just saying the author of Hebrews makes tantalizing remarks. In other words, he's not calling him God, but, he does say some things that, are interesting. They cause you to raise your eyebrows or something. And my response to Shabir in the debate was, to simply tick off a number of things that the author of Hebrews says, and simply to retort, are these merely tantalizing, or do they in fact call him God? Right? Remember, and we're going to look at these verses today, but the author quotes several Old Testament passages that explicitly identify Christ as God and Lord and the divine Son. But before even giving us these citations, the author in the first 4 verses identifies Jesus as the very radiance or effulgence of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature, right? The identical expression of his substance. And then says that he is the one who created all things and upholds all things by the word of his power. And then it says that redemption is based on his perfect and completed work. by his redemptive work, he has purchased salvation for his people. And then he sat down like a conquering king next to the Father. And so just, astounding that Hebrews would be demoted to merely tantalizing status.
Yeah, it is interesting to me because as you're saying this, I'm thinking to myself, so he does agree then that Jesus is the Son of God, because that's what chapter 1 stated. He does agree that the universe is sustained by the power of his word, because that's what the first chapter stated. I mean, how can he justify picking and choosing?
Yeah, so I think that, there's a number of things. Shabir is not consistent from one debate to another. And so I've kind of noticed that there's different versions of Shabir. So in one debate, for example, Paul is not trustworthy. But if Paul's going to be useful to another point that he wants to argue in some other debate, well, suddenly Paul is going to be his trustworthy source on that matter. So there is a good bit of inconsistency. I think what he would have tried to do in our debate is say that, the author of Hebrews gives us these interesting statements, but they don't agree with what is found in the earlier ones. And so these are less credible, right? Less reliable. Now even that notion is suspect logically, because for one, these are all first century sources. And let's just go back to the Gospels. Let's say we have these different pictures of Jesus presented in the Gospels, and they're not really uniform. They don't give us the same Jesus. Right now, we would all grant that they talk about different things, and there are different emphases that each gospel gives, but not in a competitive way. They're not at odds with one another. But let's suppose that Mark is a gospel that gives us a low Christology and John gives us a high Christology. Why does Shabir arbitrarily choose Mark over John? Right? He doesn't give us any reasons for that. He just basically wants to say the one that agrees with what I think is true, namely the Islamic view, is going to be the one that gets a pass here. Right? There's no real argumentation for why we ought to trust Mark instead of John. Now, of course, I don't agree that Mark and John are at odds with one another. And we can do a show on that sometime too, because Mark's gospel is incredible in what it presents concerning Jesus.
Oh, absolutely, brother. I would love to do more and more shows with you concerning the deity of Christ just from the Gospels. And I agree with you. Mark hits it right off the bat, with the claim that Jesus is the Son of God. Immediately. He doesn't even waste any second at the opening of his letter. There you go. Jesus is the Son of God, and it goes from there.
Yeah, in fact, I was watching the other day. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a late night show guy, and I wasn't watching this. This is an old broadcast. I was watching an old recording of this because it had Bart Ehrman on, and you know that he's the darling of Muslims. And it was really funny because here's Bart Ehrman, this guy who does have scholarly credentials in the area of textual issues regarding the Bible. He's not a theologian. In fact, honestly, reading the guy trying to talk about Christian theology and do exegetical stuff is it's watching a train wreck. Just the other day, I was passing on an article to somebody from another scholar that Ehrman cites in one of his works. And this scholar is basically blasting Ehrman for misrepresenting him and using him to justify these theological claims that Ehrman was making. But in any case, Ehrman is the darling of Muslims. They just think everything he says is gold. And it was really funny because Ehrman was making the claim that the earlier Gospels don't teach the deity of Christ. And this host, who's not a scholar by any stretch, right? He doesn't qualify in any area of Christian studies, but he was just taking Ehrman to task. And he says, well, doesn't Mark's Gospel call Jesus the Son of God? And Ehrman says, well, yeah. And so then the radio show host says, well, what is the son of a duck? And he says, well, it's a duck. And he says, well, what is the son of a tiger? He says, well, it's a tiger. And he goes, well, then what is the Son of God? It was really funny because
that's interesting.
Yeah. And that's the basic idea, isn't it? When we call Christ the Son, we're essentially saying, we're obviously not saying that the Father and the Son are father and son in the exact way we might think of when it comes to human father and son relationships. We're saying there's an analogy there. There's something about the father and the son in terms of how they relate to one another that is mirrored in some sense in human father-son relationships. It's obviously not understood in a anthropomorphic sense, right? God is not a physical being according to the Bible, so he doesn't literally beget, in a bodily sense, right? So the Bible says God is spirit, John 4:24, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And so that's one thing that we have to take away from the father-son equation. It's not speaking of Jesus as the son in some kind of bodily sense. We also have to recognize that God is eternal. And so this relationship, which understand, and I don't know that Christians today sufficiently appreciate this, but father and son are correlative terms. It means that you can't have one without the other. The Father is the Father precisely because of the Son, right? And the Son is the Son precisely because of the Father. You can't have a father if you don't have a son, or a son unless you have a father. And so if the Father is the Father precisely because of the Son, well, then the Son must exist eternally. Otherwise, the Father is not eternal. And so the other thing that you have to say is not true of the father-son relationship is that it's to be understood temporally. When we say that the Father begat the Son, we don't mean that this was something that took place in time. There wasn't a time when the Son was not. This is an eternal relationship that exists between the two. And there are other things we can say about the differences, but the essential thing that we're asserting is that the Son, though personally distinct from the Father, he's from the Father, he bears his Father's very essence. That is the essential thing that's being communicated when we talk about Father and Son. And so when you say that Mark's gospel begins by calling Jesus the Son of God, it's already affirming Christian theology and is opposing Islamic theology. And that's more relevant than some of the viewers might be thinking to what we're going to talk about today. So we weren't really going off on a wild tangent there. But
Yep. No,
yeah.
that was awesome. That's a good segue. And let me just again welcome everyone who's joining us here. And thank you for our moderators for the great job you guys do. And I noticed that someone was saying that Sister Chloe speaks Arabic. If that's the case, we definitely need to connect, because I'm always looking for people that can help me with both of my channels. With that in mind, brother, where are we going to start from in the book of Hebrews chapter 1 today?
Okay, so in our past programs, we've looked at the first 4 verses, which we've somewhat summarized already. The first 4 verses identify Christ as the supreme revelation of God, precisely because he is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature, the one who created and upholds all things, and the one who provided redemption. And now then we're looking at verses 5 through to the end of the chapter, through verse 14. And this is where the author of Hebrews begins to provide a litany of quotes from the Old Testament to substantiate all the things that he's been saying. Right. So the basic thrust here is the superiority of the Son to the prophets who came in the past and gave us a partial revelation of God, and the Son, who is the full revelation of God because of who he is, and the superiority of the Son to the angels. So now this is where the author is really emphasizing the Son's superiority over the angels. And so he gives us all of these quotes. And the first thing I want to point out is that these quotations are actually bracketed by 2 passages that are the most quoted in the New Testament, right? Verse 5 says, "For to which of the angels did he," meaning the Father, "ever say, 'You are my Son, today I have begotten you'?" So here the Father is presented as saying about Jesus that he is the Son. Verse 5, that's a quotation from Psalm 2. And then at the end, the last quotation that he gives is verse 13, which is a citation of Psalm 110. "But to which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet'?" Now, there's a couple of things here that people might stumble over and think are something of a problem, a wrinkle in this idea that Jesus is the eternal Son of the Father who bears his essential nature and therefore is God. Now, it should be obvious that the author of Hebrews in the first 4 verses has been claiming that he's God. So these verses, as they're understood by the author of Hebrews, don't contradict that. He's citing these things for the very reason that in his mind, these things are support for what he's been saying. Moreover, the citations that he gives in between these explicitly refer to the Son as God, as Lord, and so forth. But here's the interesting thing. So these 2 passages are actually intertextually related in the Old Testament. And that's actually just a fancy way of saying that there are certain verbal and thematic parallels between these 2 Psalms. This was recognized by ancient Jews and also by the early Christians. Very often, when you see one or another of these passages quoted, both passages are quoted. And that's because they saw a fundamental link between them. And that, again, that's true in ancient Judaism and in the earliest writings of post-apostolic Christians. And the thematic link should be obvious, right? Psalm 2 is a psalm where it talks about the nations raging, trying to throw off the yoke, the reign of the Lord and his Messiah, his anointed one. And then the Messiah speaks and says, I will declare the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. So this is the Son quoting words of the Father, right? These are words spoken to the Son. The Son is declaring them. Now, nobody, I'm sure, missed that word begotten, right? Today I have begotten you. But what stumbles people is this statement, today I have begotten you. And a lot of people think, well, if it's saying today I have begotten you, that seems to suggest that the begetting of the Son is something that took place in time. It's a temporal act. Well, here's where the important link with Psalm 110 comes in. But before I show you the link, you have to notice something in Psalm 2. Of course, in Psalm 2, it goes on to say that the Son is going to reign over the nations, right? All the nations are going to be subjected to him, and all the nations are to do him homage. It says, kiss the Son in verse 12, 2:12. Kiss the Son, lest his wrath flare up against you and you perish in the way, right? But the important thing to note about that statement in 2:7 is that even though the Son says, today I have begotten you, he's quoting the Father, notice that the quotation of this on the part of the Son is not telling you the time when these words were originally spoken. Okay, this is a very subtle point, but it's an important point, and it's one recognized by scholars. But it says, I will tell the decree of the Lord. He said to me. So he's reporting words that had been stated long before this event. Okay?
That's right. That's right. Excellent point. Exactly.
Yeah. Long before you declare what somebody has said, if you're reporting something, the report takes place after the event itself. And so the $1 million question is, when is this referring to? When did the Father say this to the Son? And one thing people may not know is that the word today in Scripture is used in some interesting ways. It doesn't always have reference to a literal temporal day of 24 hours, for example. In fact, what does the author of Hebrews say when it comes to, well, later in the book of Hebrews, he'll quote an Old Testament psalm where it says, as long as it is called today, make every effort to enter into his rest. And what the author of Hebrews is saying is every day is today, right? Every day is today, and is when you are to, avail yourself of the opportunity of repenting and turning to God in faith. And so as Christians recognize, God himself has no temporal succession, right? God exists eternally. Every day, in some sense, is today to God. Another way of expressing that, and this is how Jews would do it, is to say that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, right? There is no difference for God. One day does not literally pass into the next for him. It's not like he's rotating around the sun, right? The sun is something God created. So, in fact, that statement that expresses the eternity of God is actually said about the Son in Hebrews 13:8, right? It's the Son about whom that's said. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. In fact, that forms an inclusio with what's stated in Hebrews 1:10, right? The author of Hebrews cites Psalm 102, where it says, "You, Lord," this is the Father speaking about the Son, "You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment, and like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end." So the idea here is the unchangeable nature of the Son as the Lord who created all things in the beginning. Okay, so
Exactly.
this kind of gives you a little bit of a background to where I might be going with this. Well, here's the link then with Psalm 110. Obviously, thematically, they're talking about the same figure. If Psalm 2 speaks of the Son reigning from heavenly Mount Zion, it says, "I've installed my king on Zion, my holy hill," and he has reign over the nations, and everybody is to do him homage. It has to be the same person in view in Psalm 110, right? David in Psalm 110 says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." But then he goes on to say some other things about the Son. He goes on to say in verse 3, let me pull this up here real quick. But he goes on to say in verse 3, "Your people will volunteer freely on the day of your power. In holy splendor from the womb of the dawn, your youth are to you as the dew." Now, if you know this, Al, because you know Arabic and you talk about the manuscripts when it comes to the Quran and so forth, but Hebrew, like Arabic, when it's written, it's originally it's a consonantal language in terms of how it's written,
Correct.
right? Hebrews, Jews don't write with vowel pointings. That's a later thing. That was, in fact, it was a later thing that was done for the benefit of people who didn't have the same kind of proficiency in Hebrew as earlier Jews would have. But any native Jewish speaker, if you go over to Israel or some other place where you're dealing with Jews who know their language, all their printed texts are just going to have the consonants. They don't have the nikud. They don't have the vowel pointings. And that's not a problem for a native Hebrew speaker, just like it wouldn't have been a problem for Arabs in the past. Now, I don't know how it stands with Arabs today. I would imagine.
No, I hate to say this, but it's a problem for early Muslims who transmitted the Quran, because we're having all kind of problems, But again, the God of Islam promised to protect and preserve the Quran, whatever that book might be, whichever one, we don't know yet.
Yeah. Well, and part of the problem that they have is they've always made the claim, the boast, that the main way the Quran was preserved is through the oral recitations that were passed on. But the different vowel pointings that you see added in the later manuscripts reflect how they were orally reciting these things, right? And so obviously these things weren't being preserved in oral speech because they're adding different vowel pointings in different manuscripts, and there are other things going on, right?
Exactly, brother. Yeah.
Well, now we've never been the ones to make the claim that we haven't made the same claim that Muslims have. We recognize, if we know our own textual history, that God originally inspired the prophets to write, and they used consonants. They didn't put the vowel pointings there. Now, ordinarily, that doesn't create a huge problem. Any person who speaks the language well will know what vowels have to go there. And the change of a vowel can make a big difference. But grammatically, it tells you how the word is functioning in the sentence, whether it's singular or plural, active or passive, or whatever grammatical terms you want to talk about. But what we know now, and really this is not just now, but this was something people could have known in the past and did know, but it's not been as much appreciated by a lot of people today. But the way ancient Jews read the consonantal text turns out in a number of places, especially in messianic texts that are prophetic of the Messiah, the way ancient Jews read them is very different than the way those same texts are read by some of those texts are read by Jews today. You know, some people will look at their New Testament and they'll see the New Testament writers citing the Old Testament, and they'll say, why, when I go to the Old Testament, does the citation look different? And that's because, unfortunately, a lot of our translations are following the later Masoretic scribal way of reading the Old Testament text. This is later, it's post-Christian. Okay, the Masoretic text, the consonantal text is basically the same, right? We don't really have any difference there, nothing to speak of. It's the way they're reading it, the vowels that they see or place in those with those consonants that makes some of these differences. Not in every text, but usually it's in messianic texts. So as an example, one example is this. In Psalm 22, the way Christians would read it in verse 10, it says, it's talking about the suffering of some, we would say the Messiah, but the psalm starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then it goes on and talks about him being surrounded by evil men. They're casting lots for his clothing. His heart is like wax that's melting within him. He's enduring extreme agonizing suffering. And then in our translations, it says they have pierced my hands and my feet. Okay, that's the way ancient Jews read it. And happily, our translations do it right there. But if you were to look at the Masoretic text, it ends up coming out like this. Here's this person expressing his extreme suffering. And then when you get to this verse, it says, like a lion, my hands and my feet. And commentators look at this and they're scratching their head thinking, what in the world does that mean? Right? Now, remember, I said ordinarily, it's not a problem for a native Hebrew speaker to know which vowels belong there, because adding any other vowels than the ones that were intended would end up resulting in gibberish. And so one of the ways we can tell that the Masoretes are actually giving us, the wrong vowels is because they give us these gibberish renderings. That's gibberish in the context. It doesn't make any sense. Go check the commentators and they'll tell you, even if they don't recognize that this is a result of the Masoretes, right? If they're just looking at the Hebrew text, they're looking at it saying, have no idea what this is talking about. Doesn't make any sense in the context. Well, you have something similar when it comes to Psalm 110. And this isn't just me saying this, by the way. And I'll give you some other indications of this in a moment. But there's a Jewish scholar named Michael Rydelnik. He converted to Christianity.
Can you bring the book closer so people can see the title, and you can read it, the title when you get a moment, brother? Yeah, very good. Yeah. Thank you.
So his name is Michael Rydelnik, and it's called The Messianic Hope. So Michael Rydelnik is a Jewish convert to Christianity, and when he became a Christian, he experienced a onslaught of Jews. Because he grew up in a Jewish home, a Jewish context. And so people are bringing their rabbis to him. They're all trying to bring him back to Judaism. And so he delved into these things very deeply. And one of the things he realized was, if you don't listen to the Masoretic vowel pointings and just look at the text, those readings that end up being gibberish, a very natural reading is immediately suggested to you when you look at it, without the Masoretic vowel pointings. And those readings make perfect sense. And so here's the remarkable thing. When you look at something like the Septuagint, which is the Jewish translation prior to the time of Christ, prior to the Talmudic and medieval rabbis, often the case, the Jews before Christ read these things in exactly the way Christians would read them today. Right, the way that Christians ought to read them. Some of these we are aware of, but one I'm going to suggest to you in a moment is one that a lot of Christians aren't aware of. But in the Septuagint, you often find it following a more Christian reading. And And by following, I'm not even speaking precisely there, because it's Christianity that follows. The Septuagint preceded the advent of Christianity, and so this is how Jews were reading the text. That's one bit of evidence for this. But here's how it actually reads in the Hebrew text of Psalm 110:3. If you don't follow the Masoretic vowel pointings, instead of saying your youth are to you as dew, and that isn't, and even there, the translation is fudging, because the Hebrew is even less intelligible than that, right? With the Masoretic vowel pointings. But if you take those vowel pointings out, it literally says, before the dawn, before the morning, the light of creation, I have begotten you. That's what it says about this figure in Psalm 110. In other words, if you just look at the consonants, the word for begotten is the same exact word that's found in Psalm 2:7. Okay, so this is what I'm saying creates an intertextual link. Jews recognize that when you have two significant words in different contexts, then the two passages probably have something to do with one another, right? Especially if the word is not used often, or if it's talking about the same kind of subject matter. And we have all of that here. The word isn't used that often, and it's talking about the same subject matter. So go back to my observation about Psalm 2. Remember, I said Psalm 2, the Son is quoted saying, quoting the Father saying, I will tell the decree of the Lord. He said in the past, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Here's Psalm 110:3 telling us when that was. It was before creation, right? Before the beginning of space, matter, and time. Before the world existed, before temporal reality, spatial reality, all the things that are true of our existence, right? We are all products of, we exist in a space, matter, time continuum. And so, I mean, this is remarkable. And so this, coming back to Hebrews, these are the two passages that he uses to bracket his quotations from the Old Testament about the Son. So
that's interesting. So just a side note, what do you recommend then for people to read when it comes to the Hebrew? I mean, the Tanakh, or what exactly? Translation of the Hebrew, I should say.
Well, so first of all, let me say this, because I don't want this to be misunderstood. I'm glad you asked this. By and large, the Masoretes did a great job. There's not really a whole lot of issues. It's really in these passages where, they have an obvious bias, right? Another classic case in point would be Isaiah 7:14, right? Where God says to the king, he says, ask me for a sign, anything as high as heaven or as deep as Sheol, because the king needs some kind of sign to confirm for him that God's going to do what he promises. And so God is saying, you ask me for a sign. And then the king pretends to be pious and says, oh, no, I'm not going to ask you for a sign, right? And then God says, he's going to give a sign then, right? And then he says, behold, and in our translations, it says, the virgin shall conceive and bear a child. Now, here, there's no difference in the word or the vowel pointings in the Masoretic text. But Jews today will argue that the word is to be understood just of a young maiden. It doesn't mean a virgin.
Right, the word that was used for describing the female, basically.
Yeah, so there's no difference here, but they do try. There's no difference in how it's written, even in the Masoretic text, not just the consonants, but the vowels. But what they'll try to argue is that it just means a young maiden. But number one, when you look at how the word is used in the Old Testament, there's no case where it has to be understood as just referring to a young maiden. There are certain texts where it must be understood of a virgin, right? And so when you have those two factors, then that's the basic meaning of the word. Besides that, it only works contextually if you understand it to be referring to a virgin. God is talking about giving a great sign, as great as high as heaven or as deep as Sheol. The idea that a young woman giving birth to a child is a sign that measures up to, those stipulations just doesn't wash, right? It's clearly talking about something grand, something that is out of the ordinary. And so only a virginal understanding of that word works. Well, that's how the Jews interpreted it 2 centuries before Christ in the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, where you have a variety of Greek words that they could have used, they chose the specific word that means virgin. And that's how Matthew cites it in the New Testament. Matthew being a Jew, right? Matthew was a Hebrew speaker, and he's not introducing this. This is how Jews were saying it was to be understood even before Matthew. So this just gives you an example of what I'm talking about, though, that you get this bias. If you were to look at a Jewish translation today of Isaiah 7:14, it would say young woman or something along those lines. And so when it comes to the consonantal text, the Jews were usually very good. There's nothing really problematic, except when you get to certain places, especially those places that are significant with respect to a messianic understanding. And so, as far as, I mean, really what you should do here in the first place is just sort of recognize or follow the lead of the New Testament authors. Right? The New Testament authors are writing before all of this post-Christian rabbinic stuff. Okay, they were Jews. They're writing this. Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews from the tribe of Benjamin. Right? No slouch. Educated at the feet of Gamaliel, in a central location for Jewish learning. Right? He grew up in, or he was from Damascus, and then of course went to Jerusalem, and he was a Pharisee. So these guys weren't slackers. They knew their Old Testament. They weren't dependent on the Masoretic vowel pointings. And we have things from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint that kind of help us here. But my basic point is, if you see something in the New Testament, then that's an obvious tip-off as to how these things were being read. So if you go to your Old Testament and it doesn't quite come out into English that way, that's a hint that maybe the issue here is that the New Testament authors were following the same consonantal text, but not reading it with the same vowel pointings, right? They were reading it more in line with how ancient Jews read the text. But the other thing would be, you could read the Septuagint. Now, I'm not saying the Septuagint is always perfect either, right? It's difficult to go from one language to another. And, there are times when the Septuagint is not the best. The Hebrew is always the standard, the consonantal text. Right. So if you have something in the Greek that's not consistent with those consonantal readings, then that's a problem. But so the basic standard is the consonantal text. The vowel pointings of the Masoretes are more like rabbinic commentary. This is how we read this. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful, but I think
it is. And I wanted to say, I'm glad you brought the Septuagint also, because sometimes I look at the Septuagint and say, okay, how did the Jews understand this particular passage when they translated it? That's important for us to understand their line of thinking, because it's extremely important for us to recognize their acceptance of certain interpretation. And I like the Septuagint because, like I said, it's still before this Masoretic kind of biased, interpretation at a later time. And I'm glad, we have manuscript evidence to back up and support what we believe. Not like we're relying on people on us, what we ought to believe in or not. I want to just address someone here who's a Muslim. Salam, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you'll be enjoying this. And Salam asked if this is a debate. And Salam, yes, it is. And guess who's winning? I'm just beating answers left and right now. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah. Okay. So the point we've established here is that the author begins and ends by citing these two texts that talk about the central figure of these texts as begotten of the Father. And notice, since we've got a Muslim guest and we're talking about Shabir's attempt to sort of dismiss certain things, notice that the author of Hebrews, in identifying the Son as the begotten of the Father, is following the Old Testament, right? Psalm 2:7, even in the Masoretic text, says, I have begotten you, right? And if you just follow the consonantal text in the ancient Jewish reading of Psalm 110:3, again, you have it affirming that this one was begotten. This is certainly not Islam, but this is precisely Orthodox Christianity. We believe that the Son is the eternal expression, the eternally preceding or proceeding Son. He comes from the Father, bears his very essence. And this is the origin for a lot of other ways of referring to Christ as well, by the way. He is also called the Word of the Father, right? A word is a person's self-expression. It comes from him, proceeds from him. So you can see the similarity there with the idea of begetting, right? We're talking, about God as a spiritual being, not a physical being. So this is understood spiritually and in a transcendent way, not in a crude corporeal or temporal way. But this other imagery comes from this. He's called the Son, the Word. He's called in Hebrews 1 earlier, he's referred to as the radiance of God's glory, the outshining of God's glory, right? You can't have the light without its radiance, right? But the radiance does come or proceed from the light. And so all this kind of imagery is basically tapping into this same basic idea that the Son shares the Father's very nature, is the eternal expression of his Father. And this, of course, is 180 degrees opposite of later Islam. And it's opposite to later Judaism. Okay. And this allows us to make an important point. Often Muslims think that their case is bolstered by the fact that they agree with Jews. But all they're saying is that Muslims and post-Christian Jews are both at odds with the early Christians and the early Jews, right? Because the earlier Jews are the ones who read it this way. The authors of the New Testament were simply, sticking these things under the first century Jews' noses and saying, what do you do with this? Right? This is how you read the text. This is how we read the text. And so Christians have an embarrassment of riches here. We are in a continuity with the Old Testament and even with Second Temple Judaism, whereas post-Christian Jews and post-Christian Muslims are themselves at odds with all that came before. The Judaism after the time of Christ isn't the religion of the Old Testament. It's a reworked, version of, pale imitation of authentic Old Testament religion. And so the first point that we learn here then from the author of Hebrews is that the Son is the eternally begotten of the Father. Then he goes on to say, he goes on to quote 2 Samuel 7, where it says, I'll be a father to him and he'll be a son to me. And then he begins to cite some passages about the angels. Okay, and what you're supposed to see is there's a stark contrast between how the Father speaks about the Son and how he speaks about angels. Okay, most people will recognize that biblically the angels are greater in power, right? They're not greater in significance or in terms of their eternal destiny. The scriptures tell us that man was made in the image of God and was destined for glory and honor. Men, the righteous, are destined to be exalted above the angels, right? That's why Paul can say in Corinthians when the Corinthians are falling out with one another and they're going to court with one another over their differences, and Paul's rebuking them, saying, what's wrong with you people? Don't you realize that you're going to judge angels and you can't even solve these disputes among yourselves? You can't say this guy needs to give that vacuum cleaner back to Mrs. Kravitz or something. Obviously, they didn't have vacuum cleaners back then, but the point is,
are you sure? Are you sure they don't have vacuum cleaners?
maybe they had these Flintstone-like versions where there's like
there you go. That was my favorite show, by the way.
Yeah, I always liked how they came up with inventions that existed in the past of that were ancient versions of contemporary technology. So like if you had a radio player, you'd look at it and think, how's it playing this record? And then you'd look inside and there's this bird and its beak is on the record, right? Acting as the record needle.
Yep,
anyways, but the point is, angels, at least now, are greater in power than us, and they hold certain exalted positions. There are orders of angels, right? The New Testament, the author of Colossians, the Apostle Paul, speaks of principalities and powers and so forth. He's giving you words that distinguish between this hierarchy among the angels. We have statements about the archangel Michael. An archangel indicates a chief angel, right? So the author of Hebrews is taking this fact into account. Here are these beings who at present occupy more exalted positions than men, but the Son, he says, is greater than those angels, right? Greater than them in every way, greater than them inasmuch as the name that is his by nature or by inheritance is greater than theirs, right? As the eternal Son of the Father, who bears his Father's very nature, the Son is greater than them. And so, having already said that the Son is the one who is the begotten of the Father, he goes on to say of the angels in verse 6, the Father says this to the angels about the Son: let all the angels of God worship him. So God commands the angels to worship the Son. Now, remember, according to the Old Testament, the same Old Testament that the author is quoting,
right?
You're not to worship anyone but the Lord your God.
Exactly.
Right? Worship the
Lord
Lord your
does not
God.
give his glory to another. I mean, it's very clear.
Right. So he's quoting the same Old Testament, saying the angels are to worship the Son, the same Old Testament that says you're to worship the Lord your God and him only. Right? Jesus quoted that in Matthew 4, to Satan, a fallen angel. Right?
I wonder if Muhammad got that mixed up when he said that Allah asked the angels to worship Adam. Anyway,
well, actually, in Jewish sources, you find this confusion, and there's a number of reasons for it. But the bottom line here is that it's a Jewish mistake that Muhammad makes further mistakes on. Right? Muhammad could never just let something be the simple mistake that it was. He always had to improve upon it by making it worse.
Of
right?
course, he's the master of copy and paste. Didn't you know that he invented that technology?
Yeah, yeah. But you see, you notice what happens in the case of Islam. One of my favorite stories, not because there's anything true about it, but because it's altogether ridiculous. If you look at Al-Tabari when he's talking about the creation of Adam, certain hadiths say that Allah created Adam according to his own shape and form. Okay, so the idea, according to many Muslims, is that Adam looked like Allah. Right? And he's 90 feet tall. And so Al-Tabari records this narration where it says that first Allah created Adam like a lifeless statue, right? He created the shape and form of Adam, and then he caused it to stand upright for a period of 40 years. And over the course of this 40 years, the angels happened upon this statue, and they're all afraid. They see this statue and they're terrified. And Satan, he's the genius of the bunch, right? He says, "You guys stay here." This is my paraphrase. "You guys stay here. I'll go over there and investigate." And so Satan goes over to this statue of Adam before he was given a soul, and he enters in through its mouth and then out through his rump, right? So he goes in through his mouth and out through his rear. And then he comes back to the angels. He comes back, get this is the best part. He comes back to the angels and he says, "Don't worry, guys. That one is hollow, but your Lord is solid."
Wow.
Right? So he's basically telling him, don't worry, that's not Allah. And the reason is because he couldn't get out through it. He wouldn't have been able to get out Allah's rump, in other words.
I hear you. So he's been inside Allah before, I guess, right?
Yeah, or somehow he's got some deep insight into Allah's anatomy, including how his rump works.
Oh, dear Lord. I mean, the funny part is that the angels were terrified, not knowing if this is Allah or not. So apparently Allah looked like a person. There goes the Islamic theology right there.
So once you see that sort of thing, you now understand why the angels might be required to prostrate to Adam. If he's the sort of a physical duplicate of Allah, well, then it's as if Allah made, he made a twin. And so he's commanding the angels to bow down and worship him. Well, so yeah, there's obviously some borrowing from Jewish confusion there. Now, the Jews, we don't have evidence that they went that far with it, but they did make some mistakes with respect to Adam. So anyways, back to Hebrews. So in verse 6, we're told that all the angels of God are to worship him. So this is a citation of the Old Testament, Psalm 96, as well as the Septuagintal version of Deuteronomy 32:43. Okay, so the author is citing Old Testament texts here. And then he goes on in verse 7 to say, regarding the angels, okay, so the angels are commanded to worship the Son, but then in verse 7 it says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. Okay, so their fundamental nature is different than the nature of the Son. Okay, the Son is such that he is rightly to be worshiped. He's to be given the same honor that we give to the Father, just like Jesus said in John chapter 5, right? That all men must honor me just as they honor the Father. They're to give me equal honor, right? The honor that belongs to God is nothing short of divine worship. And Jesus says, you're to give me that same honor. Well, here is the Father in Hebrews 1 saying that the angels are to worship the Son because he, by his very nature, is the Son. He bears his Father's nature. But the angels, as far as their nature goes, they're like winds. They're like fire, right? Their nature is fundamentally different from his, right? And then he comes to those verses, I think, that most of us think of when we think of the high water point in the book of Hebrews, when it comes to the deity of the Son. Now, really, if you've been paying attention to me, everything that's been said so far is really a high water point. But certainly in terms of their overt expression, verses 8 through 10 are, or 8 through 12 really are probably the most explicit. But in verse 8, it said the Father, it says, regarding the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of righteousness is the scepter of his kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your companions. This is a quotation of Psalm 45. And notice the word anointed here, by the way. Anointed is, in the Hebrew text, the word that we get Messiah from, or Christ from in Greek. So already in Psalm 45, you have this notion of the anointed one being God. But notice who it is that's calling him God. According to Hebrews 1:8, it's the Father, right? Verse 8 says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And then in verse 9, when it says, therefore God, your God has anointed you, the word God there is vocative in the Greek. And it's interesting because in Greek, by the time of the New Testament, and you'll understand this, anybody who knows something about an inflected language will understand this. But when it comes to nouns, you have various cases, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and vocative. So the nominative case is used when the noun is is the subject of the sentence, basically.
That's right.
I'm just being very simple here. But the vocative is used when you're making a direct address, right?
Yes.
So in other words, if I said, Al, how are you doing today? In English, there's no difference than if I turn to somebody else and say, hey, I spoke to Al today. I don't say your name any differently. But in a language that has a different form for direct address, it would be different. But what's interesting is in the New Testament, by the time the New Testament was written, the vocative wasn't used very often. Often the nominative would be used in place of the vocative, and that's just a fact of how the language evolved. But here, the author of Hebrews actually deliberately uses the vocative. So he's stressing the fact that the Father is calling the Son, directly referring to him and calling him God, right? So Muslims often will ask, where does Jesus say, I am God, worship me? Well, here in Hebrews 1, we have the Father calling the Son God and telling us to worship him. So if they're looking for an explicit statement and they would accept an explicit statement from Jesus, then all the more do we have, and they should accept, this explicit statement from the Father regarding the Son.
Hey, brother, let me just take a side, note here and address everybody. Chapter 5 of the Quran, verses 116 and 117, Allah exposes his lack of knowledge and his lack of authority and asked Jesus in the vocative, did you and your mother say to people to take you and your mother as gods beside me? I mean, lack of knowledge, asking Jesus for his knowledge about the situation. And Jesus's response in verse 117 is even more hilarious. Jesus is like, hey, when I was on earth, I took care of everybody. But when I ascended, I gave them to you. In other words, what did you do?
Yeah. Now it was your turn to babysit them afterwards. So yeah, apparently while Jesus was with them, everything was fine. But once they were solely in Allah's care, everything fell apart. They corrupted everything
the
under
Quran
Allah's
is
watch.
yeah, exactly. The Quran is rebuking Allah itself. It's just hilarious, man. I'm just telling you.
You know what else is interesting about that verse, and you can confirm this, but most English translations, what Isa is quoted as saying to Allah is, you know what's in my soul, or you know what's in me, but I don't know what's in you. But really, the Arabic, only some English versions make this clear. It actually repeats the word soul. Isa says, you know what's in my soul, but I don't know what's in your soul.
That's right.
Notice it ascribes a soul to Allah. That's very odd, especially if you look at certain Arabic lexicons. It usually says something along the lines of the word soul is used to refer to the immaterial aspect of man in its embodied state.
Yeah, the word nefs here that was used, which is nephesh in the Hebrew.
Yeah, and so it's So, but when at least according to certain Muslims that I've read, when you're talking about the soul in its disembodied existence, you use the word for spirit, right? And so this goes back to my statements regarding Allah as an anthropomorphic being.
Exactly. No, you're right. I mean, because he's talking to Jesus, and Jesus is talking about himself as an embodied person with a soul. And Jesus responds like, well, you're like me, you have a soul too, but I don't know what's in it.
Yeah. So, the Quran is,
is a book of knowledge, without a doubt. Just you have to wait until the knowledge is revealed to you.
Well, I don't know where to go with.
Take more sips, man. I mean, calm down, bro.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, we could spend a lot of time here. I mean, the essence of what this is saying, though, is already clear, I hope. The Son, in myriad ways, is identified as a divine person, the eternally begotten Son of the Father, who bears his Father's very essence and glory. He's the radiance of his glory. He's the one through whom the worlds were made. He is the one who upholds the world. He is the one who provided salvation for mankind. And this is true not just according to the author of Hebrews, but according to the Old Testament that he's quoting. And we have that from all these citations, from David in Psalm 2 and Psalm 110, from Psalm 96, from Deuteronomy 32, a passage written by Moses, right, where it says, let all the angels of God worship him. You have Psalm 45 being cited of the Son. He's being called God, and it says that his throne is forever. He's called the Anointed One, which also identifies him as the Messiah. In verse 10, he's not only called the Lord, which, again, this is direct address, right? The Father talking about the Son says, you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they will wear out like a garment. So notice this. I mean, there's a number of ways that you could kind of break down what the author of Hebrews is saying. And I love this, what I'm about to say. I think you've heard this. This is a way you can think of how the entire New Testament presents the deity of Christ. But if you think of the acronym or the word hands and think of it as an acronym, And this acronym comes from Rob Bowman and Ed Komajewski. They wrote.
By the way, I'll be having Rob Bowman soon here on my live stream.
Oh, great. Yeah. So Rob's a great guy. He's been around for a long time, has written some fantastic stuff on the deity of Christ and other topics. But in a book called Putting Jesus in His Place that he co-authored with Ed Komajewski.
And uses the hand, basically.
Right. And so the idea is that the letters each stand for something. H stands for honors, A for attributes, N for name, D for deeds, and S for seat. Okay, so what he's saying is Jesus receives the honors or worship that belongs to God. Jesus has the attributes of God. Jesus has the names of God. Jesus performs the deeds of God. And Jesus sits in the seat of God, right? So it's a perfect way to remember that. But now just go through the book of Hebrews thinking in terms of this acronym. Does Jesus receive the honors that belong to God? Verse 6, let all the angels of God worship him.
Amen.
Right? So he's worshiped. Does he have the attributes of God? Well, we just read in verse 10 about one of those attributes. It says, you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundations of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish. They're going to wear out, but you remain. It's talking about the immutability of the Son, right? That's a fundamental attribute of God. God does not change.
The unchangeability of the Son, basically, which is God, an attribute of God. Only God doesn't change.
Right. And I'll leave it to others to go through and see other attributes of here. But so far, then, you see this honor, attributes, names. Is he called by the names of God? Well, yes. Verse 10 calls him Lord. In the Old Testament that it's being quoted, it's the word or name, Yahweh, the covenant name of God. He's called God, which in the Hebrew text is Elohim from Psalm 45, right? So he's identified by the names of God. What about the deeds of God? Does he perform the deeds of God? Well, of course he does. In verse 2, it says, through him all the worlds were made. Verse 3 says he upholds all things by the word of his power.
Exactly. He sustains everything.
Yeah. And verse 10 repeats that, doesn't it? You, O Lord, in the beginning laid the foundations of the earth. What about the seat? Does he sit in the place of God on the divine throne? Well, that's the upshot. I mean, that's the driving point here of the author of Hebrews, is that he's more exalted than all created beings. Right?
And guess what? Even the Quran acknowledges this, that he is near Allah. Allah is above the heavens. Therefore, Jesus is above all the heavens, near Allah. Show me where Muhammad is.
You know, it's interesting. I listened to a Muslim the other day talking about what that means because, well, you know that 4:157 of the Quran is already a problem of interpretation.
You think? I did 19 shows on it.
Oh, okay. So, well, I assume you know, but you know, so Surah 4:157 is wildly ambiguous. I mean, it always strikes me because, you know, that very verse says that those who disagree, talking about the Jews, it says they have no certain knowledge, right? They're in doubt over the matter. They're confused, right? They don't have clear knowledge.
For the benefit of everybody, we're talking about the verse in the Quran, 4:157 to 159, talks about the crucifixion of Christ. And that's what my brother is referring to here.
Yeah, so Surah 4:157 says, the Jews said in boast, we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary. Right now, it's already a problem right there because it's pretending that the Jews believe Jesus was the Messiah, but that doesn't make any sense. They crucified him. They crucified him because they thought he wasn't the Messiah. They thought he was a pretender.
And it's actually said they killed him not, nor crucify him, which is, by the way, an Islamic way under Sharia law. When you crucify somebody, first you kill the person, and then you crucify the body after killing him. So it has an Islamic mentality in it already.
Huh. Yeah. So the verse is interpreted in a lot of different ways by Muslims. You have Muslims saying that Jesus wasn't anywhere near that cross. I mean, he didn't die on that cross. He wasn't nailed to that cross. You have other Muslims who say he was nailed to the cross, but he didn't die. He was taken down. You have still other Muslims advocating other theories, that he was nailed to the cross and did die, And you might wonder, how did they get that out of the verse? Well, I don't want to go over all those interpretations and how they get that, but I'll assure you there's a lot of different ways that you can argue for any one of those positions as the right interpretation of that verse. And one, just so I'm not leaving everybody hanging completely, there are statements in the Quran where it says when people died, don't say that the unbelievers killed them, right? Because ultimately it's saying only Allah can do that. So, it was Allah ultimately who's the responsible for them dying. He's the one who took them in death. And so some Muslims have actually interpreted that verse to mean that the Jews who are boasting about being successful in killing the Messiah, they're wrong. They didn't kill or crucify him. Ultimately, it was Allah who did this, right? So that's how some Jews have read it, which means on that reading, Jesus was killed. He was crucified. So there are myriad of interpretations here. And the reason I bring that up is just because it's the following verse that you were just talking about, where it says that Allah took him to himself. And so you have to resolve what's going on in 157 in order to talk about whatever's going on in 158, right? Because, does it mean that he was killed and Allah raised him up from the dead? Or does it mean that Allah raised him without him dying? Does it mean, any something else? But let me make this point before I forget. I find it so funny that the verse is so ambiguous and interpreted in so many different ways by Muslims, 157, because the verse ridicules those who differ with Muslims on the grounds that they are in doubt, they have no certain knowledge, right? But here's this verse of the Quran that leaves Muslims in doubt over a matter that, all of history is unanimous about, right? But they can't even agree among themselves what this verse actually means. So it's kind of funny that the verse will say that it's the non-Muslims who are in doubt, and it's the Muslims who have clarity on the matter. Well, anyways, but as you were saying, according to the Quran, Jesus was exalted to Allah. Allah says, I took him to myself. But Allah's above the seven heavens. According to Islamic theology, when a Muslim dies, he doesn't go to heaven, and certainly not next to Allah, right? Even the greatest of all Muslims won't be next to Allah. But when Muslims die, they go to the grave, and they're actually alive in their grave, right? And they're going through a series of tests and so forth. They're not going to be in heaven until the future, right? Or unless, of course, they're a martyr in Allah's cause. I guess they might get the free pass. But here's Jesus exalted to where Allah is. Well, the author of Hebrews, there's no ambiguity here. He says that the Son is seated on the divine throne. That's the point of verse 3, when it says, when he made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And then verse 8 says, regarding the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of righteousness is the scepter of his kingdom. So here he has an eternal throne. He's
Amen.
seated at the right hand of God. And so that HANDS acronym is really a very helpful way of kind of categorizing all the evidence that you find in Scripture. So if somebody wants to memorize stuff for their use in witnessing, in evangelism, in apologetical engagement with Muslims, if you take that acronym and then remember verses that tie in with that, you'll be helped in a big way. You'll have verses that correspond to all of those issues.
Amen. Amen, brother. There is somebody's complimenting you, man. MV is saying, hello, brother Alan Anthony. With all respect to Al, but Anthony is really a genius. There you go, man. So they're watching half the show right now. That's you.
Oh, I thought you were going to say, if they're calling me a genius, then they're watching only half of what I say.
Yeah, we know he's a genius. That's why he's here on our show.
Well, I wouldn't describe myself as such. I always tell people when I think of myself, I always just think of that kid that, had only read 2 books by the age of 18. God rescued me from being a criminal and, set my foot on solid ground. And so I am what I am solely by the grace of God. I quoted Cyprian earlier this week on social media. It's a basic quote. It's not anything that Christians haven't thought and should have thought at least 1,000 times. But he says we should boast in nothing because there's nothing that we haven't received. Right.
Amen.
Simple little
Amen.
quote. But I thank God for his gifts to me. I thank God for his gifts to others. But I recognize I don't have anything I haven't received, and I just pray to be faithful. And
yeah, praise the Lord for you, brother. We're so thankful and blessed really to have you. So is there anything left in chapter 1 of Hebrews? Because next time, I'll leave it up to you whether you want to jump into the second chapter or if you want to refer to another item. Again, everybody, what we're doing here for a while now is dissecting some of the tantalizing claims by Shabir Ally from the 2 debates that he had with our brother a couple of months ago, actually. So that shows you how much, stuff in there, meat that we needed to expose and also edify the body. So I'll leave it up to you, of course, next time when we meet. But for the benefit of everybody, in about maybe a week from Monday, I'm going to have my brother with me via live stream, not physically, but via live stream. I'll be in our studios, and we're going to have a marathon, Lord willing, for 2 days of live streams. I'm not going to really spoil the surprises for you, but we are lining up some amazing guests. And since I have Anthony here, and he just agreed just right before the show to join me as well. So Lord willing, he'll be one of those guests that will join us. Maybe at that time, you said you have some exciting things that you've been doing that we can really venture into 1 or 2 of those, and then we'll do another video series with you, joining us in studio like you did before. But is there anything else left in Hebrews 1, brother? I don't want to cut you off.
No, I think we've done 4 shows, haven't we? 4 or 5 on Hebrews 1. So I think we've pretty well covered it. Obviously, there's a lot more you can say about any text of scripture, but for our purposes, I think we've, said what we need to say. In the debate, I said as much as I needed to say in that context, right? Shabir said these statements are merely tantalizing. I pointed out the author calls him God. That's not merely tantalizing. That's the very thesis that I'm defending, that Jesus is God. It doesn't get any more exact than that. But I thought, and you thought, that it would be good if we delved more deeply into some of this, and we could easily turn to another topic. And I'll just have to think of another issue he brought up in the debate. But there were obviously some real howlers in there. In fact, I just got another comment from a Muslim the other day talking about how he was so surprised that Shabir got beat in that debate. Right. And I'm not, again, I just quoted Cyprian. I'm not saying that as a boast. The thing I like to point out to people is that, when I go into a debate, I go into it with utmost confidence that this person has nothing on which to stand, and I can thoroughly rout them, provided I know what Scripture has said. Right? That's the only thing that needs to be true going into that. Well, in addition, of course, the help of the Lord's Spirit. But the Lord could even use a donkey as far as that goes. Right? He could speak through a donkey. But my point is just this: that Muslims recognized that Shabir had no case. He's been able to get away with it far too often in some debates with people, playing certain games. But in our debate, it was pretty apparent that Shabir didn't have anything to stand on. So I'm still getting messages from Muslims talking about how surprised they were.
Yeah, I mean, again, I call this, we have an entire video series called Refuting Shabir, where I have 2 of, in my view, the best of the best who can really take on Shabir. My brother Anthony Rogers, and I have Sam Shamoun. And really, Shabir took an entire series that I did, brother, on the original sin, proving it from the Quran, actually. An entire series, I don't know how many videos, we're talking at least 10, and did 1 hour and spend the whole hour talking about something totally different. And maybe in 5 minutes, he said he refuted the entire series. I mean, this is the kind of stuff we deal with. And he thinks the young Muslims are that naive. They're really catching on now to the fact that the guy just was pulling their leg left and right.
Yeah, well, there's a bit of strategy there. and David talks about this a lot. I forget how he calls it. It's something like the 90-10 rule. And what he's referring to there is a lot of these guys realize that as far as their audience goes, if you just say that there's 100 people watching their show, only 10 of them are actually going to go listen to the responses. And so they know the vast majority of their listeners are not ever going to see through their lies. And so they don't care that they're just saying what they say. They think they're going to get away with it. And it's even more the case with people like Zakir Naik, right? Because he's talking to crowds of tens of thousands of people, and he knows the vast majority of them aren't going to go look up a Christian debater or a Christian scholar or something like that to see where he's, playing games with them. So I think Shabir, he just says something so that because you know how Muslims reason, they think, I was surprised by this, but I experienced it so many times now that I expect it. But Muslims really think that as long as a Muslim said something, no matter what they said, well, then you've been refuted. You've been responded to. Exactly. And so I think if a Muslim sees that you and Sam did these shows, and then they see, oh, Shabir did a show on this, so they've been answered, right? They're not going to bother to listen. Some of them, most of them.
Yeah, exactly. Just to prove your point, one of our amazing brothers in the Lord and a researcher in the Quranic manuscripts, Dr. Daniel Allen Brubaker, who came up with a book, just a small portion of his dissertation about corrections that are found in early Quranic manuscripts. I mean, we're talking a book, by the way, that so far more than 800 probably pages have been written to refute such a small book. Okay, that tells you the attention that it got. But I remember Mansour Ahmed, one of those who are involved with Islamic awareness, where they have a lot of wonderful work. I go there a lot to take a look at what they have image-wise and things like that. So I want to give credit at least to the website. He wrote a couple of tweets, and he was bragging about the fact that Sister Farida did 4 minutes to refute the book. 4 minutes. And he says, oh, the book has been refuted. And I'm like, are you telling me the years of research that this professor has done, the traveling, touching of these manuscripts at different museums, taking photos of it, was refuted by an ignorant called Sister Farida 4-minute video? I mean, this is unbelievable sometimes.
Yeah, and so I got another example here. So you, of course, know about the holes in the narrative controversy ever since Yasser Qadi went on the show with Muhammad Hijab. That led to a fury of Islamic activity and other people making concessions and other people firing back, and just this whole mess that they've got on their hands. And that whole thing is relatively recent, right? Within the past, I don't even remember the exact dates on all of this, but within the past year or two. And so the other day, I think it was yesterday, I looked at Paul Williams' blogging theology channel on YouTube. And Paul Williams, he and I go back for many years, where I've caught him lying more times than Muhammad had wives, right? And that's not easy, right? You got to reach a real number there. But that guy, he has no shame. He's committed apostasy from Islam, 5 or 6 times. Each time, I hate to tell you the reason why, but basically because he wanted to engage in a certain kind of activity that would have gotten him killed.
Sam Jamon talked about it a couple of days ago. I know exactly where you're going with that. But yes, yeah, so, go ahead. Yeah.
But the guy has no shame. He does that just to get away from the punishments, but then he becomes a Muslim again. So his heart is in Islam, and he hates Christianity with a passion. He loves to attack, and he'll use anything he possibly can get his hands on to attack Christianity. Well, the other day, like yesterday, this is one of his most recent videos. He has he says he's going to respond to the whole, these people that talk about the holes in the narrative, and he's going to quote a scholar that responds to this kind of thing. And he picks up this book, and it's by Abdel Halim. And I recognize, this is an Islamic scholar, but that book wasn't written as a response to any of this. That book was written, it's basically touting the standard narrative. Right? It's not a response to Yasser Qadi saying there are holes in the standard narrative. Right? I think he thinks he's pulling the wool over. He probably is, a lot of his Muslim watchers. But Abdel Halim's book is just another example of people spouting the normal stuff, right? This is how we got the Quran. It's perfectly preserved, not a single variant in the Quran, all this stuff. No, that's not true. And Abdel Halim's book doesn't refute any of that. He's not even, dealing with any of that evidence.
Brother, it's just so disappointing because recently, and I'm not going to get into mentioning names because at some point we will refute the most recent work against the book by Dr. Brubaker, but even renowned Islamic scholars who specialized in the field of early Quranic manuscripts, sometimes they lay aside their intellectual capabilities and they just come up with this standard narrative. And I can tell you why, out of fear of being marginalized or retaliation. Look what happened to Yasser Qadhi for daring to say that there are holes in the narrative. And the guy wasn't kidding. He was telling the truth. He wasn't exaggerating. You can back up what he says from Islamic sources, actually. But unfortunately, it's the bullying, the process of bullying and intimidation. And that's pretty much how it went for the last 14 centuries. But I can tell you this much, brother, and I'm sure you can agree with that the social media had exposed all of it. There is none of it that will be bought by Muslims anymore because they're tired of it. And now they can see things at the privacy of their own home.
Amen.
Yep. Well, brother, thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you for the amazing, exegesis that you've done for us today. And I love the way you addressed, those couple of passages from Hebrews 1 and the depth, of course, of what's involved in there when it comes to the deity of Christ. We look forward, of course, to continuing this. But most importantly, I look forward to having you on April 26th. Moderators, I'm going to need all the help I can get from all of you on April 26th and 27th. I'm just going to give you a teaser. I'll have David Wood also. There you go. Joining me in live stream. Just a teaser.
You gave it up.
And then I'm going to give you another teaser. Woo, two. You get the idea. Who else is going to be joining me live stream also? So we're going to have all of these amazing heavy hitters, and we need all the help that we can get. I wish and I pray one day we'll have all of you with me physically, actually, but thank God also for the technology. And of course, because of all of the limitations that are taking place right now from one state to the other, from one place to the other over COVID. So we need to also be respectful of everybody's time and also, respect the law as well. So with that in mind, brother, any last words? Is there any upcoming debates? I mean, are you debating anymore this month or next month?
So I'm supposed to debate a oneness or modalist on the Trinity on May 10th on the Gospel Truth channel. And if people go to my channel, I'll give updates and links to that and so forth. And I was also told I'm supposed to debate Shabir 2 more times in May, but I can't remember the dates. And the topic this time is supposed to be, 1, can we trust what the New Testament says about Jesus? And then the other debate is, can we trust what the Quran says about Jesus? And so really it's a discussion on the authenticity and integrity and reliability of the sources that both of us have, with a special focus on what they tell us about Jesus. So I just don't remember the dates on those, though, but I'll be announcing it on my channels when I remember.
That'll be great, brother. That'll be great. As always, let us know and we'll announce it for you as well. And may the Lord give you, of course, stamina, strength, wisdom, and guide every step and every thought, brother. Thank you so much for your hard work. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. This coming week, we're going to have some exciting things happening. Pray for Sam. Sam's traveling. That's why I haven't done any show with him, because Wi-Fi and other things, and he's been working hard also, so I don't want to bombard him. So I may have Sam in the next day or two. We're going to have a show with Brother Alex and a special guest that deals with politics. I mean, some of you don't know, but I definitely have a passion for politics, but I only use that card when necessary. So we're going to have one this Wednesday, April 21st. We'll make the announcement probably by tomorrow. And then hopefully we will have more guests towards the end of the week. And then next week, watch out for the announcements for April 26th, April 27th. We're going to have a packed live streams along with other things that we will be doing, of course, these 2 days. Again, thank you so much, brother. And Lord bless you and bless your work. Everyone, we have posted for you how you can bless our brother by subscribing to his channel and by supporting him. So that's my hope and that's my prayer that you would do so. Thank you. God bless. Take care, everyone.